Well, Jan and Chip, thank you so much for being with us today and taking the time to share with not just Angus and I, but letting us share this conversation with our group. We're really looking forward to speaking with you both. And for those of you in the group who don't know Jan and Chip, they are some of the original students of Sydney Banks. They have been sharing the understanding for since the early days in all over the world in all kinds of different settings, from corporate settings to prison settings to individuals to organizations. So you've really had incredible life experience bringing the understanding into the world. And Angus and I have both been very blessed with being mentored by you in various ways, and listening to you share and really being impacted by what you shared. And also, not it's not happening this year, but on Salt Spring Island, where Jan and Chip live, is where the Three Principles School is held, and Chip Chipman and Elsie Spittle are the co-founders of that school. And Angus and I have been up there a few times and really enjoyed that experience as well. So thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny that the school has become like a 3P Mecca, hasn't it? It's a pilgrimage that you have to make at some point in your life. I know I'm glad that I have.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, Jan and Chip, I just love you guys. I think, that what you bring to the table is just so beautiful. And, you have such an authenticity and an honesty about you, that the way that you speak and point to this understanding is just so clarified to me in a profound way. So I'm really thrilled that you'd be willing to, to have this conversation with us today.
Yeah.
Well,
So
thank
we'll
you. It's an honor, really. And
Yes.
I can't think of anybody else in the world that we'd rather be talking to than you two, because I think you're serving this cause of the principles and serving people like nobody else I know. It's really beautiful.
Oh, that's very
Thank
kind.
you.
Thank you. So we'll tell you a little bit about what we're up to in terms of this conversation. So Angus and I have been using a metaphor of rewilding as a way to point to how we as human beings can be rewilded back to our natural state of love. And we see this understanding, the understanding shared by Sydney Banks, as what has been profoundly impactful on us in terms of helping us become rewilded individually back to that natural state of love, rewilded in our relationship in terms of how we experience the love in our relationship, and just in all areas of life. And so it's been really fun to use nature and that metaphor as a way to point to how we can always come back to our true nature, that essence. And we can, it doesn't matter how much conditioning or cultivation or taming has gone on with us individually, societally, in relationships, that we can always let what's true come back and lead the way. So that's how we're using this metaphor. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's for me, just to hear you kind of describe that. It's kind of we're up against the standards and expectations of our conceptual mind that can look like the right way to travel, but really what we're pointing to is our essential nature, to take our lead from that. And then nature is just such a beautiful example about, left to its own devices, it always knows the way. It always knows how to find balance and harmony. And we get so enamored by our intellect and the conceptual mind that really we've missed the point, and that's where I feel like we get into trouble. And I guess why that metaphor, I feel, is so apropos.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense to you.
It does, actually.
Yeah. And it's beautiful, because I find one of the most inspiring things in life is that every year everything renews itself. And I love being in nature, walking, and I love being in our backyard and just being out there with the trees and the birds and everything. And it's still, to me, no matter how long I live, that it's such an amazing thing that out of the ground, just every spring come all the same flowers that we know are going to come back. And it's just like, to me, that never stops making me feel a sense of wonder and hope, like in the winter when you just wish you had some warmth or just whatever, but just that sense that everything will renew. And that's been, actually, that metaphor has been helping me through this time when there's so much unknown.
Oh, absolutely. Same here. The idea that the natural state is perfect. The natural state within, there's nothing wrong, nothing's ever been wrong. The idea that the true self can't be damaged no matter what. That's what I hear you saying with that metaphor, and I absolutely love it. It reminded me of one other thing, though. I had a client in Florida that had a wonderful airplane. I mean, it's a really great airplane. I went up with him a few times, and he was talking to me about what happens naturally with an airplane. And he showed me, but it always scared me on my wits. He took it on a really hard bank to the left, and the nose dipped down, and he put his hands up like this, and the plane just straightened right up. And he had me do it, and it's hard to let go. You've put it into this weird angle, and it doesn't feel right, and you want to do this, and you just let go, and the plane just straightens right up. And I feel that's a really good analogy as well. Just the idea that we've been trying to control our lives, all of our lives, thinking that control is the way to get to the natural state. And it's absolute opposite. It's letting go of control, just being quiet within yourself and allowing the natural state to show itself. It's always been there.
That's awesome. And Chip, what I really love about that story is, like, now I know the source of this metaphor that I've heard other people in the community mention from time to time, and you were the person that actually had lived through that experience, so you can tell it with a whole other extra layer of meaning that's so profound. I love it.
I don't think I've ever told it before, so I think it coming out in the community is probably a well-known thing.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, and that is sort of, it can be hard, like you're saying, just like in the plane, to let go of control. Like, I think letting go of control is one of the hardest things that we do as humans. It's a peeling away process. We're like, I've let go. I'm like, oh no, I haven't really let go. Oh, there's another layer to let go of. And so, one of the things that I'd love to hear both of you share about is how that process of letting go of control, of allowing your true nature to lead you, how the understanding has supported you with doing that in your lives. And you can just share whatever examples come up, because I know that you've been around it for a while.
I'd like to share, this is what I call my new story, because my original story is when I first met Sid Banks, and I was a super unhappy person and just plagued by worry and insecurity. And then I met Sid, and I heard him say about how if everyone could see who they really are and how beautiful they really are, they'd have all the happiness they could ever imagine. And so that, in that split second, I heard something so profound. 45 years ago, it turned my life around. And then maybe 6 years ago, I was feeling controlled by life. And so what I would do is I'd get up in the morning, and I'd just want to check the news or check my email. And one day when I woke up, I realized, I kind of myself admitted to myself that I was a stressed out person, and I was waking up in defensive mode, and I just realized the absurdity of that I knew better than that. And that was the morning when I realized that, well, in the beginning, I heard something when Sid talked, because he managed to break through to my true self. And so I thought, now I'm in the same spot. I need to just go back to square one. And I saw that all I needed to do was, when I got up in the morning, instead of feeling that the world was controlling me and I had to be ready and I had to get on top of things and start my day and hear what was going on out there, I realized I needed to just have some quiet. And so I started listening to Sid in the morning, or reading something of Sid. And lo and behold, my whole world changed to a whole other level. And I'm still on that journey, and still starting my day, slowing down or staying slow after I woke up, and just transitioning from sleep and that quieter state, and just being open to learning about my true self and then engaging with the world. And it's changed everything in my life all over again.
Mm.
Same for me. Same for me. I'll share a practical example that just happened a little while ago. It has to do with COVID and everything. We have a relative who was really upset and disturbed by COVID and things that had happened around it. And I got it in my head that somehow I had to help this person. And I'd be reading one of Sid's books, and I'd read a passage, and I think so-and-so needs to read this, you know. And I thought I was over all that a long time ago, trying to tell people about this. It was just stuck in my head. So I told Jan, I said, you know, I wish so-and-so would really ask us something or read something, like they're suffering so much. And she just said Jan is not a worrier. Jan just said, you know, the only thing we can do is live it ourselves. We can't make anybody listen. We can't make anybody learn. We just have to live it ourselves. And I still couldn't let go of it because this is somebody I really care about, and I was really having a difficult time with it. So it turned out we were going to have a phone call with this person, see how you're doing and everything. And we picked up the phone, we had it on speaker, and just out of nowhere, all that stuff just disappeared, just went poof. And we just started talking ordinary stuff, like really the most ordinary stuff ever, but we were in a really neat space. And a third of the way into the call, that person joined us in that space without talking about anything. And I know that person was in a much higher state of health by the time the call was over without addressing anything. So that's what that felt like to me, was us going back to that natural state and not trying to control, not trying to change, not trying to help, even though our intentions were good, right? And the next time we talked to that person, they were doing much better. You know? So I find that really interesting. And that's a lot of the way that Sid taught when he was around. He wasn't, we've said this so many times, but he probably talked about the principles and spiritualism and levels of consciousness 5% of the time that you ever spent with, if that. But there was something else, you know, there was, for the most part, he had his days, but for the most part, he lived in that natural state. He was like a kid in a toy store, you know, most of the time. And if you went with that, when you were with him, you would end up in that state as well, no matter what was said or not said.
That really points to how it is inside of each one of us. It's not about the words, and that it wants to come forward. And that when we relax, like you did in that phone call, and you were just yourselves in that state of being, that is what wants to come forward. It reminds me of the flowers that you're talking about, Jan, in the garden. Like, they want to come through the surface. That's just the natural design. We don't have to make that happen. You're not there tugging them to come up. So we all want to experience our true nature wants to be expressed through us. That's the natural design.
And I love the idea that, you know, that you just fall into it. So in the same way, Jan, that you talk about, you know, walking in nature, and there's something about becoming present to that sort of, you know, to being in the moment with it, and seeing the beauty that interrupts the sort of the noise, the chatter. And I imagine that would be the same experience you'd have with Sid, you know, that there is this person really, you know, coming from that direction and then pointing in that direction. And at some point you just drop in, and that has a natural resonance. It's, you know, that's speaking to our essential nature as human beings. And it's, you know, it's a beautiful feeling, just as you would have in nature, walking amongst the forest. It's like, you know, this is who we are. And I love that. Sorry, there's a teenager stomping down the stairs in the background. Make a whole
Couldn't hear it.
noise. Rahini has a very good poker face in dealing with that. I haven't been able to tune that out yet. But yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, I love that idea that that's just something that we drop into, and the noise stops, and we have this moment of beauty. And that's the feeling I imagine that Sid was always pointing to. Look for the feeling, don't listen to my words, because the words is such a realm of the intellect. and the intellect is so easily stimulated and so compelling.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. And yet we have that moment where the noise stops and we just are present to what is that divinity, I guess, within us all.
Yeah. And there's such a simplicity that I know that you both speak to in terms of how it is in the feeling, how it isn't in the words, and how that's really what we're all wanting to orient ourselves toward. Like, Jan, when you're getting up in the morning, you're orienting yourself to that deeper feeling inside of yourself. And so anything more that you'd like to share about that, I think would be lovely to hear.
Well, Angus, when you were talking about that, being around Sid and getting quieter, I'd love to also share that Sid loved nature so much. And I don't think we, as much as we, spent time outdoors or appreciated nature, when we met Sid and his first wife that they loved their backyard or their garden, but there was this feeling of a feeling of closeness to nature that was so part of Sid and it was to him that was like his church in a way. Like he would be in his garden, or he would have these special spots where he loved to walk where there were a lot of ferns, because we live in a kind of a rainforest environment up here, or down by the sea, and so he would, if you were with Sid and just sitting in his kitchen looking out at the back garden, then all of a sudden he would stop talking, and then you'd feel like you had to say something in the early days. And I started to catch on and just let go of that discomfort of just sitting there quiet, not making conversation. And then you just slip into that quiet, and it was like you get a chance to really see with your spiritual eyes, like really, and your physical eyes, like really see the beauty. And so he really did help us appreciate how quiet does really bring you back to nature and your own spiritual nature. And it is the default setting. We started out when we were first born, we weren't talking, or we that was our natural state. And it's beautiful that we can communicate through words, but to be able to fall back into that. I like the way you said that, Angus, like fall into it. It's such a beautiful gift, because it is in the unknown that we discover even more beauty.
Yeah, we start out in that quiet, but then we acquire data for good reasons, to learn how to live in the world.
Yeah.
Then we don't know when to stop acquiring. And so it leads us into this funny position where it's the absence of data where we see wisdom.
Yeah.
And we understand the data. It's like sometimes when we talk, I get a sense that some people think that we're saying that the intellect is the enemy. And I don't believe that at all. I believe how we use the intellect can be the enemy. But it's been proven to us over and over again, especially in corporate work, for what it's worth, that as people get quieter, as people get to that place where they're more at peace. I love that way that Sid puts it, that peace of mind is a mind that's at peace with itself. But we saw so many times, not just in the corporate world, but with many people that we work with, that they had very busy intellects, and some of it was useful and a lot of it wasn't. In fact, a lot of it was counterproductive, right? But we saw that as they got that quiet, they began to understand what data was important and what wasn't, right? Both in terms of personal life and business, and they learned to have a healthy respect for moments when data wasn't it, when you were just quiet, And then you could look, to me, it's a matter of being able to look at everything from a different perch. It's not trying to change all the details in our lives and so on. It's actually getting quiet enough to acquire a perch that's separate from all of that thinking, from all of that data, and then looking back at it. And that's my definition of wisdom, is the ability to look from neutral. And you see all kinds of things you never understood before. I mean, that's the essence of what Sid's been sharing with us for years, is that in the quiet we learn to see.
Yeah, I love that, and it kind of feels to me like, you know, if you think about, you know, and it is important to make that known, that we're not demonizing the intellect. You know, there's an invaluable piece of equipment. How
Or,
else would we experience our humanity? It would be impossible. But it's kind of like, I like the way you say you kind of got to know when to stop. You got to know where you know, it has its potential, but it also, it's a storage system and a processing center. And the new information, we have to make room for that new information, and that can only come in the quiet.
exactly.
And I remember listening to a musician being interviewed on the radio once, and this is a successful singer-songwriter in the UK. And the interviewer asked him, you know, like, you know, what is the process to writing a hit song? And he said, there's no process. I just go and sit at the piano and I just wait for it to arrive. You know, it comes out of the quiet. It doesn't come out of any kind of process, some intellectual pursuit. It just comes to me through grace, but in that quiet. And so he's making room for it. He's like knowing the value, and like, yeah, it doesn't come from my intellect. It comes from something else. And that is that quiet that, you know, I guess you're pointing to.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely beautiful.
It's such a strong reminder. And what I hear you both saying is that introducing the quiet back into daily life is what creates so much space to hear more deeply.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. I had a client, a CEO of a large chain, a hotel chain, and very creative guy, created some amazing properties, did things that nobody had ever done before. And he reached a point where he saw major changes coming in the market, and he knew that they really had to change how they were doing business in many, many ways. And he had to convince a board of really big change, you know. And he told me he was going to be doing that. And he called me one day and said, you know, I'm going nuts. I can't sleep. You know, it's just driving me crazy. And he said, can we talk? I said, sure. So I went over to his office, and he had his long lists of pros and cons and what ifs, and this person thinks that, I don't know how to get it across, and just on and on and on. And
sounds like a detective with a
Yeah.
picture board.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I could see bags under his eyes. He did not look good. And he said, what should I do? And I didn't know how to answer him. And it just popped out of me. And I said, how long before you have to make this presentation? He said, about a month. I said, okay. I said, well, I think you got to take your wife and kids to Hawaii and forget about all this for a couple of weeks. And he looked at me like I was insane. There's no way I'm going to do that. But long story short, I got a call from a day or two later it was on my answering machine, and all it was aloha. Going off to Hawaii. But it was really neat. He went off, and he told me later that he couldn't relax for the first 3 days, and then he finally just started playing with his kids in the sand and walking and so on. And he just decided to go with it, you know. And they got back on the plane to fly home. He took out a yellow pad and wrote out the whole thing in like an hour. And
Wow.
he didn't have to change anything. You know, he knew exactly what he wanted to say. He just needed the perspective. He needed to be able to look at it from a quieter perch.
It's so interesting because that is a beautiful story. And while you're telling it, it occurred to me that right now we have these challenges, you know, that some people are starting to travel and do some things. But what I love about this latest challenge of being home and not going out as much as we used to, the travel part has been a relief for us because we were traveling a lot with business. Like, you know, we would be gone like 5 or 6 weeks through this May and June for the last 6 years. And this year we got to be home. And but what's happening for me is I'm I loved the fact that we were home, and then we didn't have to do all that traveling, and it made it less tiring. It took a lot of stress out of life for me, and it's less tiring to have to keep packing and unpacking. And but then I noticed that because we're not going anywhere, it's like every day is the same. We're and we love our work. We're so happy that we can, and that's what changes is we see different people every day. But basically the days are the same. It's like Groundhog Day, almost like everything. But what's happening for me is something happened where I just started to have fun with it. Like when you said like being like a kid in a toy store, I realized, well, I've got more time just to have my life the way I want it, and so I'm just slowing down and just trying on different clothes that I used to think, well, I remember when I used to be able to go out for business and I used to wear those clothes, and now I just wear some things at home that I would have worn to go out somewhere. And I know it's a simple thing, but it's like I feel like I am kind of like a kid, just playing with life. And the other part of me wants to say too that I know that we are very, very fortunate.
Oh, absolutely.
And that there's a lot of people out there that don't have that luxury. But I know that whoever it is, if they have the understanding of the principles and understand where life is really being created from, I know that those people that are having to face the challenges are also finding help in knowing that they're being creative, like we hear from people that are still working outside of their home or working all day at home, but that wisdom is just bringing them the ability to just fit that into their joy of life. And at the same time I do that, and that leads to the other thing of part of what I've been experiencing being home is being grateful that we can be home and how lucky we are. So there's just so much learning. I feel like there's so much learning.
It really is. It's funny. It's an adjustment, but it's almost like a slow and gentle adjustment. I don't know how to explain that, but I'm actually, again, I know that people are suffering and I do feel for that, but I'm actually enjoying this immensely. We're getting to see each other differently. We're getting to know each other differently. And I hear most of our clients are saying the same kinds of things. I have one client who, I'll put it this way, I wouldn't say was paranoid, but definitely had a lot of thinking about what people thought of him at work and his boss, and is this person undercutting? It was hard to get to talk just about the quiet when I first started talking to him, right? But he slowly slowed down and started to do a little bit better. But after the COVID thing, he said the most interesting thing to me. He came on one day and he just looked like $1 million. He was smiling and everything. I said, "What's up with you?" He said, the last couple of weeks, I've just felt great. I haven't felt any stress. I'm enjoying the kids and I'm enjoying my wife and I'm enjoying work. He said, it finally dawned on me. He said, I had all of that stuff I was thinking about, when I went into work. And it's just not here anymore. And he said, I realized one day I was thinking about it, but it wasn't happening. I was just, he says, maybe that's the way it is even when I am at work. But the quiet allowed him a little break to take a look at that, and the fact that he wasn't in that environment worrying about what so-and-so thinks and so on. It gave him that little reset, if you will.
Yeah.
It's really cool to hear.
Yeah, I love the idea of that quiet kind of being a North Star, certainly with this understanding, because I've certainly heard of, people dealing with this whole COVID experience and the isolation. And, this idea that, they get bored with that, and I love, Jan, the way that you're talking about this in terms of being like Groundhog Day, because I think without this understanding, people have this sort of aversion to boredom, like boredom is a terrible thing. And with a different perspective, actually, you look at kids in their boredom, that's where they find their creativity and come up with all these like wonderful ideas.
That's true.
And kind of like we lose we lose perspective on that, perhaps as adults, that boredom is demonized. It's a terrible thing. And then all the chatter, starts to ensue. And then we get gripped by it. And before you know it, we've developed a habit around it. And it starts to look like anxiety. It starts to look like this big problem. And then left to our own devices at home in self-isolation, I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm so bored, I don't know what to do. And it's because they've created this habitual thinking and demonized boredom. And in a sense, the boredom actually, if we're looking in the direction of the quiet, will be an opportunity to come up with something new. Mm-hmm. Whatever that looks like, there's going to be a good feeling, I'm sure, once we really settle into it.
I think that's right. In quieter states, especially if we're lucky enough every now and then to really just stop the world we're projecting constantly. We're just lucky enough to have those moments. In those moments, boredom is impossible because the world is so amazing. It's so fascinating, right? So the thing that I think sometimes people think the quiet is boredom, but that's because they don't sit in it long enough to see what's there.
Right.
They want to manufacture something.
Yeah.
Been there, done that. Got the T-shirt.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think boredom is oftentimes, like you're saying, Chip, it's that it's part of the slowing down process. And if we just keep going with it and don't dip out of it at that point, then we get to experience what you're describing, just the presence, we're not bored when we're present. We're bored when we're not present. And I really appreciated what you were acknowledging about, just that you have the privilege of being able to enjoy this time, and that some people are have much more challenges, but that what you're pointing to is that this understanding is still going to be helpful. It's not just for people that are experiencing privilege, that this, what you described as the perch, Chip, like the ability to zoom out and to have new perspective on current situation, no matter what circumstances are, that's going to be beneficial. So I know that you've done work in lots of different communities with different levels of privilege and not privilege. So I'd love to hear if you've got anything to share about working with some of the less privileged communities.
The prisons, probably.
And inner city.
Inner cities as well.
It's really beautiful that one of the places that we worked, we were invited in by a corporate client to work in with the city. They were hoping that we'd start with the police. We ended up working with the police as time went on. But when we went to the mayor, the first thing the mayor said was, well, I think I'd rather you worked with housing. And so it didn't want us to go with the police. Right. But years later, that happened as well. But we were watching the news and seeing where a lot of the protests were happening, and the city that we were working with years ago, that the reason we'd been brought in because there had been a lot of unrest and some upset in the community where people were out demonstrating and everything, and it was frightening, but when you looked at it with compassion, you could see there was good reason why people were so animated in it. And so anyway, years later, we were watching this community and seeing how they handled it so well. I mean, they were like one of the models of people getting out and speaking and protesting, but there was a sense of respect in that community, from the leadership and then the people, the residents and people in the community. And it really touched me because I'm not saying that we did anything, but I know that there were many organizations within the community and in law enforcement and different venues, jails and everything, where a lot of people really took to heart what we shared. And we would always just share Sid's materials and we got in deep, in all the different cultural parts of the community, all the leaders of every kind, business community. So it really hit me that you could see, like, I think years ago what it looked like it would have been a whole different thing when those people were still, there was that gap, or that confrontation between the community leaders of the various backgrounds. And now where there's peace in that community. And so it really hit me that we moved away, I guess 13, 12 years ago, and left everything, all our work behind. But to see that, hopefully, that those leaders that really took to heart about the principles, that it kept on,
Absolutely.
So that was really heartwarming for me to see that.
It was, like there was a time when I was more or less diagnosed as being hypervigilant. I grew up in a home with violence and everything, so that's probably a pretty accurate assessment of where I was at one time in my life. But when we started working in so-called threatened communities, or communities that were really at risk, that's pretty much what we saw in terms of how people were. I mean, we worked in communities where we knew people, we knew women who at some nights took their child into the bathtub because there were bullets flying around. So how could you not be hypervigilant living in that environment? And yet, when Sid's materials were introduced, his books and his recordings, and we did our talks and worked with people, that idea of hypervigilance can be looked at in terms of you're so afraid of everything that you look at everything with a laser beam at this item, and you worry about this, and when you're finished worrying about that, you jump over to this one, and your consciousness is on this very narrow thing, right? But as people started to realize that there was something inside where they could have some peace, where they could experience quiet, what we saw happening is that consciousness opening up, where they could see all kinds of opportunities and ways to help their community and their friends and their family that was always there but not evident to them because they were in that narrow hypervigilant. So I think that a big part of why the principles have been so effective in what we used to call at-risk communities and the prisons and so on is that the very people in those communities listen to what Sid had to say and to read his books and so on, and just slow down that hypervigilance to be able to use the health they have within. And so in every one of those things we worked in, it was the people who solved the problems. It wasn't the social workers, it wasn't the programs. Not that there weren't good programs that were useful to them, right? But it was their change of vision. I guess they're elevating how they were looking at it to a higher perch that allowed them to resolve it. It was the same in the prisons. Like the women's prison we worked in, we won't name it, or it's gone. They tore it down. It was horrific. I mean, the conditions were unbelievable. It had been a home for juvenile delinquent kids at one time. So there really weren't cells. There were these huge dorms that would have like 50 people in them. Right?
Wow.
90 in one of them.
90 in one, that's
Wow.
right.
Good.
And so when they converted, they had all these adults, many of whom had severe mental illness, and they were all sleeping in this one space, screaming at night. The women would come into our class, and the first thing half of them would do would be put their heads down and fall asleep. They were so sleep deprived, right? So I can't imagine worse conditions. And it was in a hot state, but in the winter it would get cold. And if you didn't have money from somebody from outside, you couldn't buy a sweater. So you'd walk around shivering all day. I mean, honestly, I couldn't believe that this was actually happening in America, that people were treated this way. But as people started to have insights into themselves, they started to help each other. They started to just wake up in the middle of the worst circumstances you could possibly imagine. They began to see that reality in a totally different light. Right? And it proved out in so many ways. The violence rate dropped precipitously, which the warden noticed right away. The gang thing slowed down. It's a women's prison, but believe me, there are gangs in the women's prisons as well. And then we started to see things that were even beyond that, where it wasn't just that they were dealing with the environment, they were actually becoming really happy in that environment. And so much so that even corrections officers would go to them for advice. It was a phenomenal thing to watch. And I think it's the same thing that they were finding their wisdom. And then looking around at the very same, believe me, nothing had changed, but seeing something different and actually even seeing beauty. And they started to appreciate how they helped each other and so on. It was, as long as I live, I'll never think that was the best experience of our life, really. Is working in that prison and seeing the courage and wisdom of those people in that unbelievable environment.
Yeah. It made me, I don't know if this is the same prison, but I remember you sharing a story of how one of the people you worked with who funded the work in the prison, how they acknowledged him. It was just so profoundly moving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you want to share that about when we brought Reese in?
Well, if we do it, make it short, because I think it's.
Yeah, okay. We're going to run out of time.
Could be a long story, but
well, we'll make it short. The person who funded the program was a business client of ours, a CEO, and he also had a debilitating disease and was going to die before too long. But he was funding this whole program, and it was supposed to be a secret that he was funding. There are issues with the family being concerned about, convicts and so on. But anyway. It came to this point where the warden was really touched by what was happening, the deputy warden, and he'd never gone in. As a matter of fact, Jan wrote an email after every class that described these amazing things that happened in the class. And he just really wanted to. So we thought, well, we'll just ask the warden. He had this big electric wheelchair, so it was a big deal. And she said, well, of course. Mm-hmm. And they made it happen, and we ended up in this chapel with 70 or 80 women in this big chapel. We did some talks and stuff, and this person was in an electric wheelchair. At this point, can barely move anything but maybe mouth and eyelids, right? And the corrections officers were standing at the back of the room watching. And when it was clear that we're pretty much finished the talks, one of the women illegally stood up. They're not supposed to move until they're told to move, and walked out to the aisle. And I could see some of the corrections officers itching a little bit. But she walked straight down the aisle and she kissed our friend on the top of his head. And then another one stood up and came down and did the same thing. And then another and another. And finally a line formed. And just about every woman in that room did the same thing. It was the most amazing thing. I get choked up when I think about it. And there was corrections officers with tears in their eyes.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was a phenomenal experience.
Yeah. It's just so moving to see when that true nature comes forward. It doesn't matter who you are, what circumstances you are in, that the beauty of the love of who we are when that comes forward is profound. Mm-hmm. And miracles happen.
Yeah, they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it says a lot when you say that that's some of the most meaningful work that you've done. Like, you can see how deeply touched you both were by that experience. And I think oftentimes it's the gratitude of the people in those circumstances that they feel the impact even more. Like, I know when Angus and I have done volunteer work in the prisons here, the level of gratitude of the inmates when we're willing to listen to them and not judge them and just be with them and see them human to human, like things that we take for granted that we're going to be accepted as just a regular human being. They are so moved by that. And it is so inspiring to see sort of their true nature get expressed and come to life. And I know in the prison that we worked in, it wasn't a principles-based program, but it was very much focusing on that loving essence inside of each one of us.
Wonderful.
That they noticed the recidivism rates go down significantly, like hugely. And it just makes complete sense that people change and their behavior changes as a result of that.
I'm so glad you guys were doing that. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that it's kind of like, for all those years ago, you planted a seed of truth. And in our essential nature, that, that's always very fertile soil. So you're now getting to see the fruits of that, in terms of the community is still impacted by those seeds germinating and now, you know, being passed on generationally in a way that it's affecting society. That's fantastic. How cool is that?
And that it allows people to, like, what I heard is, it sounds like people are still speaking out and speaking for change, but they're doing it in a way that includes respect and understanding, that has, you know, even more power behind it, in that sense, to be able to, it's not about acquiescing, it's about still working to a better life and more equality and justice, but it can be done in ways that are empowered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As the greatest change makers in history did, like Gandhi and
Mm-hmm.
you know,
John Lewis.
John Lewis, for sure.
Yes. Yeah.
A beautiful person.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I love how and I haven't listened to Judy's talk at the conference yet, but she was saying how she spoke to the connection between this understanding and social justice, and how there's just a natural coming together when we see who we are. We want to have that expressed more fully in the world.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah.
You know, I used to take that old saw about love cures all as yeah, it's a nice thing, but that really is what cures it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember one of the first classes we ever did, where the women were quite confused about what we might be doing or what we were about. But we managed to work with them and get a nice feeling going, and the feeling in the room was beautiful. And they were asking, well, how does this fix us? How does this change our behavior? And I remember asking, you know, this nice feeling that you have right now, can you imagine doing anything to hurt yourself or anybody else when you have that feeling? And in unison, they all answered, absolutely not.
Yeah.
You know, so the point is to get to that loving feeling.
And one of my favorite stories is when we it took a while, but we got invited into the jail in the city where we lived, and to work with the youth. And it took them a while because they didn't know how to fit us in there. And then finally, the person in charge of inmate services, you know, she had a stroke of genius, and she said, well, in the youth, the program for youthful offenders, they have to go to school because they're in prison, but they're jail, but they still have to be in school. So they have a little classroom, you know, it's all, you get locked in there and everything. But once a week in the afternoon, they had a space in their curriculum. So I forget what the title was, but we came in and filled that space. And so when we went in there, these were kids from like probably 16 to 18
14
or
to
something.
18, yeah.
That young.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were young and all young men, and they'd come shuffle in with they had kind of slippers and then their uniform and everything, and they didn't know who the heck we are, and it dawned on us we were old enough to be their grandparents.
Yeah,
like
for
it
sure.
hit me, and okay. And so we just started talking, and the teacher's in her little office to the side, like with the door open, so she's kind of keeping an eye on them, right? And she was very strict, but it turned out she had a big heart, but she was kind of watching to make sure we were okay, kind of thing. And we just got to know them. We didn't start saying, well, we're going to teach you this, we're going to make you better, or whatever, you know, people or whatever. We're just like, we just went in and just got them at ease, but they were like most of them very defiant, and the ones that weren't, of course, they had to follow their peers, right? So we didn't feel very popular or wanted.
On the first day, they all turned their backs to us. Yeah.
In the beginning,
Just the first day.
So anyway, as you can imagine, things got a little better, but then partway through, a few weeks maybe, one of them was saying that he wished that he could share with some kids that weren't as fortunate. And I'm like, oh my gosh, because he was talking about some home in Tampa where they had juvenile offenders or who were young, and they didn't have parents or something, and their parents lost their parents or whatever. And he was saying, And I thought, oh my gosh, like, I mean, he had either been there himself or had a friend who was there, I guess. But he's like, yeah, I'd like to help. And they were all like, yeah. And I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, like, talk about the most beautiful sign of growth, that they were really hearing something. And so we said, okay, we'll think up a project, we'll all figure out a project. So then it turned out, I think we figured it out that day that what they could do is they could make some little cards. And I think that's the same young man thought of it, that would say have a little picture and then a little note to cheer them up and say, there's someone thinking of you, don't give up hope or whatever. And like, so I said, well, we'll make this happen. So the next week, and I don't know how we got it to happen, but
it wasn't easy
they
to get
actually
scissors
let
and
us
stuff.
get paper. It was like paper, just paper and pencils and
right.
colored pencils
Right.
and crayons. But that was like huge,
Oh, yeah.
because you don't bring all that stuff in there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So then we start this project for the little greeting cards that we actually could get to this organization, to these little kids, that they could send. So but we were trying to figure out, I said to Chip, well, we got to find a name for the project, and we can put it on the back of the card. And I said something like, I don't know, some cheery title. And he says, Jan, these kids aren't going to want to have a title like that, they're going to, like, that's not cool, right? So we get in there that week, and one of them came up with this title. I forget what it was, but
I do too, but it was our hands
across the world or something.
Something like that.
And like they got a little logo with this little globe with these, and it was just like, it was so sweet. And this was the toughest kid, right? He was like the real tough one.
He was a leader.
But so they surprised you, like we had our limitations on, and how beautiful and loving their little hearts were, right? And here it came out of them.
You got to picture this. Like, one of these kids was third generation in the same gang. He's got the teardrops printed down his face. They have that look, the whole thing. The young ones, not so much, and they were terrified to be in there. Okay. So you picture this group of kids, many of them 17 and 18-year-olds, all bending over a table with crayons and colored pencils, making these sweet cards for kids they think are worse than them. I pull my chair back and I'm watching them going, I don't believe I'm watching this.
Yeah.
The teacher's like, what? What the hell's going on here? And the corrections officers would actually take us aside and say, what are you doing to those kids? Usually we have to come in and yank at least one or two of them out in every class. It never happens with you guys. And I know what it was, is that we just didn't look at them as broken. We didn't look at their behavior, and they felt that.
Yeah.
They could feel that.
Yeah. You could see, you were seeing them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's, with this understanding, it seems so obvious that you guide them back to, to their essential nature, who they really are. And like you say, Jan, those are the factory default settings: love and altruism, and looking out for our fellow human beings, brothers and sisters. That's their natural state. And it's like, you get to remind them of that, and then they settle into it and look at the beauty that comes out of that. Society views them as hardened criminals, but that's just, an illusionary label, as it were, in terms of through the vantage point of this understanding.
Yeah, it's not who they are.
It's not who they are. They're not broken.
And that's, sorry, go ahead.
No, I love that, what Angus just said. They're not broken.
Yeah, that's right. And it again, it's another example of how close to the surface that love and understanding is. Mm-hmm. Like, even in that environment, even with the behaviors that they've done, that their natural care and love was right there as soon as they felt safe enough, it sounds like, to be able to let that out. That they could trust you both.
Yeah. And then, the authorities just see the teardrops down the face, and
exactly.
And you see the love.
Yeah. I understand. We did learn to understand how corrections officers look at things. If you're going in every day and you're meeting everybody that's committed these violent crimes and everything, of course you're going to.
And you're outnumbered.
And you're outnumbered. We really saw that. Like, I'll admit, when I first started working in corrections, I got a little judgmental of the corrections. Not all, but some of the, because some of them were really harsh.
The officers.
But we came to see it differently. We came to see that, you know, it's a hellish world. They've got a lot on their shoulders, you know, and they changed. So that's the other thing. They did change. Not all, but most of them that were around those programs changed.
And it shows you about judgment, because when we went in as to work with the women in the prison, that was our first, you know, encounter with officers working in prison. And they were officious because their security, they have to keep their, again, they're outnumbered, right? And so, and they're taught and they're trained, and so they have to keep that persona when you go in there. And then, but we got invited to train the staff once the warden saw the change in all these women attending our class. They're like, what are you doing? Can you train the staff? You know, so we started staff training. And so then, as we normally do, we do interviews before we have a retreat. You know, we did 2-day retreats with them. So then we get to sit in a room individually and see them as people, you know. And one of the officers that I had thought was so aloof ended up being a good friend. We used to go shopping together afterwards. We found out we lived in the same neighborhood. We got to be girlfriends after. And but she was the first example of it, that she was so aloof. But at the retreat, getting coffee, she was there getting, and I was almost afraid to say, you know, like, you know, can I pass the sugar or whatever? And she let down her guard. Like, even in the interview, maybe you interviewed her, but it's just like there was just this veneer of officiousness that she was kind of locked into.
Yeah.
And she shared with me, as I got to know her, that she was so strict with the women because she was one of the ones that didn't want the women to come back. She wanted them to be, you know, rehabilitate and get out of there and not come back. And she really cared. And so she wasn't like sloppy about it. And so, but it looked like she was cold and aloof. So that taught me so much about how you can't judge people, you know, and how we lose out when we judge people. Like when you were sharing about loving to work in the corrections, people that don't see people with love, not that I do every minute, but when we don't, we're the ones who are missing out.
Right.
It's true. It's true.
I do have to put a note on that story about that person, because that person did change how she interacted. She was still firm.
Right. Oh, definitely.
But she began to show more love.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. It sounds like as her understanding shifted, she was able to demonstrate that care.
Yes.
More clearly.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been such a rich conversation, and, you know, it's a wonderful reminder to come back to that place of love and peace inside. And that no matter how much we have on our mind and how far away it can look at times, that it's just simple, like you said at the very beginning, Jan, of just taking a little bit of time, whether it's in the morning or the evening or whenever, to just give ourselves that space to reconnect and allow ourselves to fall into it, as you were saying, Angus.
Yeah, no, yeah. It's lovely. Being present to the love. Yeah.
And I know it can sound superficial and trite, but that's where the feeling comes in. Like it as an idea, it is, but when it's coming from experience, coming from that feeling, coming from that place that we all know, that we all have access to, then we realize the power that's actually there.
Yeah, and definitely the proof is in the pudding.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
The love pudding.
Yeah.
Careful now.
And then it's so difficult to describe the taste of that pudding. You just have to experience it yourself.
Right.
That's right.
Well, looking at you two, honestly, since we saw you in December, I just can't get over, you know, you're already such a beautiful couple, and each individually is so beautiful. and healthy and joyous, but it's like compounded, like you're even more, the feeling is even stronger. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we got to learn by beautiful people like you, so we're lucky to have you as mentors.
Yeah, no, we are.
Thank you. Well, it's a two-way street, right?
Yeah.
If there's nothing else great about these principles, is the friends you get to have.
That's right. That's right.
Really amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to finish up? There doesn't have to be, but I just want to create space if there is.
The same full circle back to what I first heard about learning to love myself and see the beauty in myself. Like, just, it's so easy every day to get kind of those little things that catch us up and make us doubt ourselves or feel regret or anything that stops you from that feeling, And I feel the most beautiful thing I've learned is just to keep letting it go when I'm questioning myself or feeling bad about something, no matter what it is, no matter how justified it seems, to just be able to go back to just loving myself and not judging myself. And that in turn has just erased so much judgment of other people. And so that thing just, you can't, like, again, love conquers all. It starts at home too, right? That's an old saying too.
Yeah. Well, that's powerful. And I do think that self-judgment, it's very sneaky. It's like a normal, we're just judging. And I'm, oh my goodness, I didn't even see how much I was judging myself.
Yeah.
How about that it's, what else could you ever learn about that you could keep learning for like 50 years and it's still brand new and you're still finding more and more love and understanding? There is nothing else. It's unbelievable, really. Like, I honestly, this last little while, I feel like we're starting all over again, but it's great.
Yeah.
That is amazing. Keeping it fresh.
Yes,
absolutely.
Exactly.
I heard someone once say, looking to that field of infinite creative potential, and that's kind of how it is. It's how I see it too.
Absolutely.
Keep on finding new stuff, new insights.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We'll share it with our group, and we'll share your contact information. You never know, people might reach out. And we just thank you for taking the time to let us know what you're seeing now and share those beautiful stories with us. So they're really moving and inspiring.
Yeah, as always. And thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you. It's so nice to spend time with you guys.
You're so beautiful. It's just so nice to keep getting to know you even more, the two of you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Lots of love. Take care.
Well, bye now.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.